This chapter has contained the central argument of the book, and so, at the risk of sounding repetitive, let's summarize it as a series of 6 numbered points.
1. One of the greatest challenges to the human intellect over the centuries has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. 2. The natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. In the case of a man-made artifact such as a watch, the designer really was an intelligent engineer. It is tempting to apply the same logic to an eye or a wing, a spider or a person. 3. The temptation is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. The whole problem we started out with was the problem of explaining statistical improbability. It is obviously no solution to postulate something even more improbable. We need a crane, not a skyhook, for only a crane can do the business of working up gradually and plausibly from simplicity to otherwise improbable complexity. 4. The most ingenious and powerful crane so far discovered is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. Darwin and his successors have shown how living creatures, with their spectacular statistical improbability and appearance of design, have evolved by slow, gradual degrees from simple beginnings. We can now safely say that the illusion of design in living creatures is just that, an illusion. 5. We don't yet have an equivalent crane for physics. Some kind of multiverse theory could in principle do for physics the same explanatory work as Darwinism does for biology. This kind of explanation is superficially less satisfying than the biological version of Darwinism because it makes heavier demands on luck. But the anthropic principle entitles us to postulate far more luck than our limited human intuition is comfortable with. 6. We should not give up hope of a better crane arising in physics, something as powerful as Darwinism is for biology. But even in the absence of a strongly satisfying crane to match the biological one, the relatively weak cranes we have at present are, when abetted by the anthropic principle, self-evidently better than the self-defeating skyhook hypothesis of an intelligent designer.
If the argument of this chapter is accepted, the factual premise of religion, the God hypothesis, is untenable. God almost certainly does not exist.
Now, the argument is jarring because the atheistic conclusion, therefore God almost certainly does not exist, just comes at you suddenly out of left field. You don't need to be a philosopher to realize that that conclusion doesn't follow from those 6 previous statements. In fact, if we take these 6 statements to be premises of an argument leading to the conclusion, therefore God almost certainly does not exist, then Dawkins' argument is patently invalid. There are simply no logical rules of inference that would permit you to deduce this conclusion from those 6 premises. So perhaps a more charitable interpretation of this argument would be to take the 6 statements not as premises of an argument leading to a conclusion, but perhaps as just summary statements in Dawkins' cumulative argument for his conclusion that God does not exist. But even on this more charitable construal, it still doesn't follow that the conclusion, therefore God almost certainly does not exist, can be derived from those 6 statements, even if we concede that each one of those statements is true and justified. What does follow from the 6 steps of Dawkins' argument? Well, at most, all that follows from these 6 statements is that we should not infer God's existence based upon the appearance of design in the universe. It's basically an argument against a design inference as a basis for one's belief in God. But that conclusion, of course, is quite compatible with God's existence, and even with justified belief in God. Maybe we should believe in God on the basis of the cosmological argument, or the ontological argument, or the moral argument for God's existence. Maybe our belief in God isn't based on arguments at all. Maybe it's based on religious experience or divine revelation. Or maybe God wants us to believe in him simply by faith. The point is that rejecting design arguments for God's existence does absolutely nothing to prove that God does not exist, or that belief in God is not justified. In fact, historically, a great many Christian theologians have rejected arguments for the existence of God without thereby committing themselves to atheism. So Dawkins' argument for atheism is a failure, it seems to me, even if we grant that all 6 of its steps are true. But moreover, in fact, I think several of these steps are plausibly false. In steps 5 and 6, what he's talking about there is the discovery over the last 40 years or so of the incredible fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. It's been discovered by physicists that the initial conditions simply given in the Big Bang are fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent life with a complexity and delicacy that literally defy human comprehension. And this cannot be explained in evolutionary terms because these are initial conditions. And so 5 and 6 basically is just expressing a hope that perhaps someday we'll be able to come up with some sort of theory that will be able to explain the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. I'm going to be speaking more about that a bit this evening, but I'll just leave that point aside this morning. Take step 3, for example. Step 3, the temptation is a false one, that is the temptation to infer design, because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. Now, Dawkins' claim here in step 3 is that you're not justified in inferring design as the best explanation of the complex order of the universe, because then a new problem arises, namely, who designed the designer? It seems to me, however, that this rejoinder is flawed in at least 2 ways. First of all, in order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. This is an elementary point in philosophy of science concerning inference to the best explanation. For example, if archaeologists digging in the earth were to come across artifacts resembling hatchet heads and pottery shards and arrowheads, they would be justified in inferring that these were the products of some unknown group of people rather than the results of the chance processes of sedimentation and metamorphosis, even if they had no explanation whatsoever who this unknown people group were or how they came to be there. Similarly, if astronauts were to find a pile of machinery on the dark side of the moon, they would be justified in inferring that this was the product of intelligent design, even if they had no idea whatsoever who manufactured this machinery and how it came to be there. In order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In fact, requiring that immediately launches you onto an infinite regress, right? So that nothing could ever be explained and science would be destroyed. So oddly enough, Dawkins is actually enunciating a principle here which would be destructive of natural science itself. So in the case at hand, in order to recognize that intelligent design is in fact the best explanation of the appearance of design in the universe, you don't need to be able to explain the designer. But second point, Dawkins thinks that in the case of a divine designer of the universe, the designer is just as complex as the thing to be explained, so that no explanatory advance is made in postulating such a designer. Now, this objection raises all sorts of interesting questions about the role played by simplicity in assessing competing explanations. For example, how is simplicity to be weighted in comparison with other criteria for theory assessment, like explanatory power, explanatory scope,